Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome and thank you for attending today's webinar as a part of Chagrin River Watershed Partners Winter Webinar Series for the 2023 to 2024 season. My name is Chris. I'm an AmeriCorps service member serving as the Watershed Steward at Chagrin River Watershed Partners. This is the 7th webinar as a part of our series where CRWP partners with environmental professionals to deliver educational presentations to other interested professionals and members of the public. We have been and will continue to promote this series through our e-newsletter, social media pages, and our website. If you're interested in learning more about this series, feel free to check out our website and sign up for more webinars that we have scheduled for the course of this month and next month. If you have questions, feel free to type any as we go in the chat box on your screen, and we can cover them at the end of the presentation during the Q&A session. Just to let you know, today's webinar is being recorded and will eventually be uploaded to our YouTube page. In my follow-up email, I will include a link to this recording so you can review it at any time. In addition, I will include a survey that helps Chagrin River Watershed Partners prepare high-quality webinars for the public and environmental field at large. A PDF file of today's presentation will be made available on the GoToWebinar page and will also be uploaded to our website in the coming days. For today's webinar, Terry Schwarz, the director of Kent State University's Cleveland Urban Design Collaborative, will present urban planning strategies for diverse climate migration scenarios. Ms. Schwarz will cover her research that explores the crossroads of urban planning, climate change, and human migration. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Ms. Schwarz, and welcome. I can't hear you, Terry.
Hello. I know. I'm all set. Thank you. Thanks, Chris. I'm really happy to be able to join you today to talk about this topic. It's something we've been working on for the last several years. So I'll just give a little brief introduction to how my organization kind of came to these questions around climate migration, particularly in the Great Lakes region, and then talk about some of the preliminary research that we have been doing, and then end with time for questions and conversation. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. Chris, can you confirm that my screen is visible?
I currently do not see the presentation. Oh, I do now. And now I don't.
Okay, now we should have it, yes?
It's gone. Now it's back.
This is so weird. Okay, because I'm not like doing anything. So you can see it now?
I can see it now, yeah.
Awesome. Then I'm going to go full screen.
Okay.
All right. So just kind of a few words about who we are at the CUDC. The Cleveland Urban Design Collaborative is the outreach division for the College of Architecture and Environmental Design at Kent State. Although Kent State is obviously based in Kent, Ohio, we're located in downtown Cleveland in the Playhouse Square district. And at this facility, we have graduate students in architecture, urban design, and landscape architecture. And we also have the CUDC's practice and research initiatives. So the CUDC staff, while we all teach in the curriculum, we are not faculty. We are tied to the university and tied to the college, but we operate a little bit independently in the communities throughout about 12 counties, engage with us on a variety of projects, neighborhood master plans, corridor studies, green space studies. We do a lot of research. We produce quite a lot of publications. We run a youth program. We're a busy little shop located within this kind of larger academic context. I say that as a preface because a lot of the work we've been doing over the last 20 plus years has been tied to some of the questions that our region has been facing, particularly related to population change, population loss, urban vacancy. It's been a kind of core component of our work for the last 15 or 20 years. Our center's been based in Cleveland for 25. This is our 25th anniversary in Cleveland. When I joined the organization in the early 2000s, we were doing a lot of pretty traditional kind of new urbanist kind of urban design strategies. But what we were discovering in a lot of the neighborhoods where we work, which tend to be neighborhoods that are under-resourced, that a lot of the things that we were drawing were not like aligning very well with market conditions. I mean, we can draw density and mixed use development, but in a neighborhood that's lost a lot of population and has a growing amount of urban vacancy, some of those kind of traditional urban design strategies don't really work. So we started experimenting with some ideas about how you can make and reshape the city in response to these kinds of changes that were underway. So how can you maintain a quality of, kind of urban vibrancy at the same time when, kind of vacancy is growing? You may know Cleveland has about 30,000 vacant lots, about half of which are in a city or a county land bank. And that's not unique for Ohio. All of the major cities in Ohio, with the exception of Columbus and maybe Cincinnati, is starting to turn the corner. But most of the larger cities in Ohio have lost substantial population. And this is a pattern that's been true throughout the Great Lakes region by and large. So we started thinking about ways that we can, kind of envision urban futures that, kind of reflect the fact that we're managing this moment of population loss and vacancy, but to really begin to set the table for future development opportunities that are more sustainable, more equitable, and more ecologically sound. So it's interesting kind of reflecting back on that. It feels like in some ways our work has been preparing for climate migration before we really even kind of thought of that as such. I will say that, kind of in a lot of the projects we work on, this kind of conversation about Cleveland's future, really people from all walks of life talk about, well, yes, okay, we've lost a lot of population, but, kind of when, kind of heat waves, when sea level rise, when drought and the lack of water begin to really impact other parts of the country, then Cleveland and other cities of the Great Lakes are going to see a resurgence. And there has been, kind of a growing kind of conversation, not just in our region, but, kind of more broadly, kind of looking at the dynamics of population change. This is between, the map you're looking at is between 2010 and 2020, but I would suggest that maybe the patterns extend back farther than that. The areas in pink on the map and red are the areas of the country that have been losing population. The areas in green are those that have been gaining. And so just kind of a quick glance at the map will tell you that, kind of some of the fastest growing parts of the country are in perhaps the most, kind of vulnerable regions that are going to be most likely and are already being impacted by the challenges and hazards of climate change. I think that maybe that's a little bit too simplistic of an argument, however, that, kind of the, kind of stable environmentally, the more climate stable parts of the country around the Great Lakes have been losing population, where the more climate vulnerable parts of the country have been growing. What I'm going to suggest to you today in this conversation is that there's no place in the country that is immune from the impacts of climate change. But the dynamic is definitely in play. The Great Lakes cities have been losing population, and areas of the Sun Belt and on the coast have been growing. This is from the 2100 project, the Atlas for the Green New Deal, that was produced by the McHarg Center at the University of Pennsylvania. And it just kind of puts a finer point on the argument around vulnerability. According to kind of this map, if you look at it, some of the major environmental hazards that we associate with climate change, wildfires, particularly hurricanes, and flooding, have, kind of are primarily concentrated, kind of in coastal areas on the Sun Belt, with the exception of flooding. The Midwest has experienced and will continue most likely to experience significant problems with issues of flooding. But if you look at this map and you look at Ohio, it kind of makes that argument that, kind of while the rest of the country in large areas is experiencing these increasing risks, at least based on this map, it looks like Ohio and Northeast Ohio are pretty well positioned. But again, I'm going to challenge that notion just a little bit, because I think it's important that we don't become complacent in our region and just sort of assume that we're well situated where other parts of the country are more vulnerable. So on that note, this is a map actually that came out of Rolling Stone magazine, which is a really strange place to get your data about climate change and climate migration. But I'm just showing you this map to suggest that the popular conversation, there's this kind of growing idea that they're going to be somehow winners and losers from climate change. And I guess what I'm going to just sort of subtly suggest here is that if you think that some parts of the country are going to win while other parts are going to lose, that maybe you're doing the math wrong. Because really, if parts of our country are experiencing dramatic changes and huge risks to human health and well-being, then I think that we're kind of all in the loser boat, and we need to figure out how to really think about land use at the national scale, so that, kind of people and communities are not at risk. But I don't think it's as simple as moving inland and moving north. I think there's more kind of complexity to it. So as part of some of this kind of discourse that's floating around out there, some cities have really begun positioning themselves, at least from a marketing perspective, as being climate havens or climate proof. I can't say this strongly enough. There's no such thing as a climate proof city. The hazards of climate change are things we're only beginning to understand, and we're all, kind of feeling the changes in one way or another. But I think a really good example, that's also a really bad example, is that in the, kind of relatively stable cities of the Great Lakes, I mean, last summer we were experiencing, kind of the same kinds of air quality issues that parts of the were, in part because of the the Canadian wildfires and the amount of particulate matter that was in the air. I mean, so many weeks that it wasn't even really safe to be outdoors. So the other point about climate change, and forgive me if this sounds a little obvious, but climate change means the climate is changing, not just in Miami and not just in Phoenix. The climate is also changing in the cities of the Great Lakes. So this map is from researchers at GLISA, that's the Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessments, out of the University of Michigan. They've done some really excellent research, data gathering, and explanations around what we might expect here in the Great Lakes. And what this map is showing is that, kind of it is getting warmer, not just in the, kind of Sun Belt of the US, but in our region as well. And those changing temperatures may put a lot of conditions, particularly the health of the Great Lakes Basin, at risk. This map is also kind of reflecting the issue of temperature, but this isn't projecting forward. This is measuring historic rates of change in temperatures in Cleveland. So Cleveland has warmed between 1956 and 2021. Cleveland has warmed by about 2.4 degrees Fahrenheit, which is pretty fast. It's faster than elsewhere in the Midwest, nationally, and in most places around the globe. So again, even though, kind of we feel like things are fairly stable and safe, we are kind of watching these trends to see kind of what ultimately might, kind of occur. In addition to higher heat, we're also experiencing more precipitation. Again, this map is projecting forward to suggest that, kind of in the coming decades, the Great Lakes region is going to be at higher risk for increased rain and snowfall, flooding, and storms. and also looking backward, that we have seen growth since from the 50s until the 2020s of about 29% in terms of the rate of annual precipitation. So again, this is just data to kind of back up the statement that climate change is happening everywhere, including here in the Great Lakes. Also important to note when we think about like flooding and sea level rise, that sometimes we think about that as a problem on the coast. But these are two inland cities, Montpelier, Vermont, and Leominster, Massachusetts, that experienced epic and cataclysmic flooding last year. And both of these cities are inland cities on rivers, which, kind of reinforces the point that anywhere it rains, it can flood. And cities that are located in a riparian valley, the way that Cleveland and other cities in Ohio are definitely at risk from flooding. And we have seen these kinds of situations happening. So again, this is just to sort of set the stage to say that if we're really anticipating kind of large waves of climate migration, we need to understand the way that the climate will be changing here, because people relocating from at-risk areas, kind of putting them into a different kind of risk isn't necessarily something that's a benefit. Also, if we're kind of, hinging the kind of in-migration argument on the fact that Great Lakes cities have access to ample fresh water, then we really need to be doing a better job of protecting the health of the Great Lakes. I'm sure that everyone on this call is aware of the challenges of algal blooms and dead zones in Lake Erie. Lake Erie is the most shallow and the most biodiverse and warmest of the Great Lakes, but it also it's the canary in the coal mine here, in the sense that, kind of the health of Lake Erie is really, kind of a predictor for the health of the larger basin. Okay, so when we think about scenarios and what it might look like, kind of in the decades ahead, I think the important thing to recognize is that there's a lot of uncertainty in these kinds of conversations. It's not as if people will wake up one morning and say, kind of living in Miami or Las Vegas is environmentally and climatically unhealthy. Let's move to, kind of Northeast Ohio. It really is, potentially a process, and it could go a lot of different ways. And so that's why we use the tool of exploratory scenario planning to try to imagine possible alternatives, plausible alternatives. So it's not as if we're going to choose sort of the one we want and work towards it, but really recognize that in a context of uncertainty, we may need to envision different kind of scenarios for the future, and be prepared to act depending on which way the forces tip. So in this diagram, what it's showing is that we don't know for sure whether the population of Northeast Ohio will grow or decline. We don't know if the population were to grow, kind of how and where would newcomers to the region go? Would it be about creating new communities, kind of at the periphery of the region? Probably, if large waves of migrants came to Northeast Ohio, the way that that population could be accommodated may be in the form of, kind of completely new cities, net zero cities that are developed at the periphery of the region. After decades and decades of trying to address the challenges of kind of the ever expanding outward footprint, kind of an influx of new residents may push that dynamic even further, because accommodating large numbers of people might require this kind of large scale energy efficient urbanism, which you can imagine. And I show, kind of Masdar here in the UAE as just, kind of a rather extreme example of what a, kind of net zero city potential, net carbon neutral city might look like. But, kind of it's one scenario that you could begin to imagine that, kind of greater Cleveland's ever outward, kind of development might go even further if, lots and lots of people were rediscovering the value of living in a Great Lakes context. The flip side would be about infill. Infill development would be most efficient, easier to manage if in migration to the Great Lakes region, in migration to Cleveland happened gradually. So this example is that Opportunity Corridor on East 71st Street. But if we started to see companies, kind of choosing to relocate to Northeast Ohio, if it was happening on a gradual basis, perhaps some of those companies could, kind of reclaim industrial sites within the city limits and redevelop those properties where there's already infrastructure, transit, kind of already in place. Same is true with, kind of an influx of population. With gradual in-migration, infill housing becomes, kind of a possibility. But if it's a enormous number of people coming to the region, it's going to be much harder. Even though, as I said, we have 30,000 vacant lots within the city, they're scattered vacant lots for the most part, and being, kind of able to redevelop in that sort of patchwork fashion is very challenging, especially when you try to do it at scale. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about, kind of potentially the barriers that might keep people from migrating into the Great Lakes region. One of which is just, I'm going to say, inertia, right? What you see on the left is downtown Cleveland, really the fastest growing city in the US, which is really interesting when you think about it. I have family in Phoenix, so I've been, having a front row seat to watch this kind of development occur. Last summer, y'all remember last summer, it was really hot, really, really hot in Phoenix. They had 31 straight days of temperatures 110 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, which is like mind-blowing. I don't know how people, kind of stand that. I know how my mother does. She stays inside, and that's what a lot of people in Phoenix do, is move from one climate-controlled place to another. Interestingly, I don't know, maybe you've read this quote, but last summer, Al Gore was quoted as saying that every night on the TV news is like taking a nature hike through the book of Revelation. And I think that that's both kind of funny and scary and also true. So, but my point here is that if you're a developer in the city of Phoenix and you are, kind of building something like what you see on the screen here, you've already invested money, you're already making money, kind of on the development just based on the kind of continued growth pressures that that city is experiencing. You're not going to wake up one morning and be like, I'm not sure this makes sense. Just stop this construction. I mean, there's a certain dynamic underway where things are being built and things are profitable. And so the city continues to grow by its own, kind of momentum. Whether that's logical or not, I won't argue that point, but it is something that's actually, kind of clearly underway. The image on the right is in the villages in Florida. And also I would just kind of imagine sort of that scenario where, maybe you lived your whole life in Cleveland or Detroit or Pittsburgh, and you get to retirement age and you're like, I'm done. I'm done with the gray winters. I'm done with the snow. I'm moving to Florida. You're in Florida. It's sunny. It's warm. You have friends. Even if it's hot, even if you deal with hurricanes, it's not like you're going to just kind of pick up on good day when they're like, all right, I'm just heading back to, Elyria or wherever you were originally from. I mean, people make choices, and again, they're not always kind of tied to climate. There's a lot of other reasons why people choose to do what they're going to do. So one of the, kind of barriers to potential climate migration is that right now, a lot of the, kind of trends in terms of real estate and investment and population dynamics are actually moving in the opposite direction. Cleveland continues to lose population where some of the other parts of the country that are more at risk from climate change continue to grow. Now, two factors that I think might change this, one being, kind of the potential for a heat wave and a power outage that occurs simultaneously. There was a study a couple of years ago that looked at Phoenix, Atlanta, and Detroit, and what would happen if there was a prolonged heat wave combined with a multi-day power outage. And if you haven't read the study, the findings of that modeling exercise was that it would be bad in all three of those cities, but it would be devastatingly bad in Phoenix, because you can imagine with 110-degree days for weeks and weeks on end, and to lose power at the same time, along with a pretty high concentration of older residents, the situation there would be pretty awful, with kind of anticipated to be high levels of mortality. So I hope it doesn't come to that. But I do think that, kind of the way that kind of human nature is, that for now, people are dealing with the inconvenience and the discomfort, if they can afford to, and they're just sort of sticking it out. It might take something truly horrifying in order to begin to change the national development discourse. The second thing that we're also seeing as a, kind of indicator of things to come is that in some parts of the country, it's becoming increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to get homeowners insurance or to be able to afford homeowners insurance. Florida has its own kind of public homeowners insurance program, which came about after, I believe, Hurricane Andrew, when it became too difficult for private sector insurers, for most of them, to continue to function in Florida. So they just left. Kind of the state of Florida does make insurance available, but whether they can do that indefinitely, as more and more people will need to rely on the public insurance program as opposed to private sector insurers, that's kind of an open question. But basically, Florida has sort of shored up the homeowners insurance sector as a way to kind of continue to allow for the growth that the state really relies on. In California, several of the kind of country's major insurers are no longer making homeowners insurance premiums. They're just not insuring there either. And so if that trend continues, you can kind of imagine people making other choices when their largest asset is something that they can't insure. Okay, so let's flip for a minute to Buffalo. This is Mayor Brown of Buffalo, talking about the potential then of a Great Lakes city to become a refuge city, a climate refuge city. And he was speaking of this in part because after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, there were a lot of people from Puerto Rico who picked up and moved to Buffalo. I don't know that they necessarily moved to Buffalo for the weather, because Buffalo may seem like a climate haven, but it still gets really cold and snowy there in the winter. It was more likely to be tied to the fact that there were existing family connections, and also, kind of programs and institutions that could support that kind of in-migration. So Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico in 2017, but then just 5 years later, kind of the winter before last, there was this devastating blizzard in Buffalo. So I guess what I would suggest here is that maybe, kind of Great Lakes cities will become climate destinations eventually, but I don't think we're there yet. There's too much variability, too much fluctuation. It's why when I say people are willing to sort of stick it out where they are, because relocating may help people get away from the hazards that they're dealing with, but they might step into a whole different range of problems. The important thing I think we can think about from a planning perspective is how do we align the forces that are pushing people away from where they live now with the things that might pull them, kind of toward other possibly more safe and stable locations. This is Hurricane Katrina, and when people left New Orleans, the areas where they were most likely to go. Really telling here is that a lot of people who left New Orleans after Katrina moved to Houston, maybe because there were job opportunities, maybe they had family ties, maybe it was close enough and felt familiar. But of course, a few years later, the same, kind of thing happened, and, kind of Texas was struck by really horrific hurricanes as well. You don't see a line here between New Orleans and Cleveland or Northeast Ohio. Some people moved to Detroit, some people moved to Chicago, but again, it was probably not a question of, kind of a climate related move, but more the other factors that, kind of get people to change location. One of the pull factors, as I mentioned earlier, for the Northeast Ohio region is the fact that we have ample access to fresh water. As long as we protect the Great Lakes, that's a resource that's here. So maybe one of the pull factors is from the perspective of industry and commerce. For businesses that rely heavily on a stable, reliable source of water, attracting industries and businesses might be the thing that happens first, and then people follow for the employment opportunities. Hard to say for sure, but it is a resource that's underutilized in our region, perhaps, in the sense that we, kind of could have more water intensive businesses. And there's no reason for like breweries to be any place other than the Great Lakes, right? But they are. And so potentially there's a growth opportunity and economic development opportunity tied to water availability and also water research and water innovation. Important to note that the Great Lakes Compact, which is what protects the Great Lakes Basin from exploitation, is not an ironclad sort of thing. It's an agreement among the states and also the Canadian cities that are at the edge of the Great Lakes. And so while the Great Lakes Compact protects the Great Lakes, basically the Great Lakes Compact, in short, says that the amount of water we're taking out of the Great Lakes Basin today is what we can take out. We can't, take more out and export it to other parts of the country. But it's important to note that, the cities of the Great Lakes states, many of them have been losing population, which also means that, these communities are losing political clout. And there could come a day, it's not an impossible scenario to imagine, when other parts of the country that are growing in population and lacking in water might find ways to legally override the Great Lakes Compact, and we could begin to see, the resource of the Great Lakes being depleted and moved to other parts of the country. That would, of course, be, disastrous for the health of the Great Lakes. But politically speaking, I wouldn't rule that out as a scenario. So kind of coming back to it, when we think about like who has a say, in Great Lakes climate migration, there's a growing movement around this idea of the rights of nature, that, maybe Lake Erie and the Great Lakes Basin also have a right and a say in what happens here. Who speaks for the Great Lakes? Is, I guess still an open question, but before we start talking about in-migration or moving water, the health of the Great Lakes and the ecosystems of the Great Lakes should have, a voice in this conversation. In the lower right corner, that's Ian McCarg, a hero of mine, somebody who talked about, design with nature and how do we, if we are going to be experiencing an increase in population in the Great Lakes region, how do we organize that development in a way that doesn't undermine the health of the Great Lakes and doesn't do the kinds of damage that the cities of the Great Lakes, caused when these places were first developing, a couple hundred years ago. Are there ways that we can revisit these ideas of design with nature and ecologically sensitive development, so if people are moving back here, at least they're not, doing damage, to the Great Lakes Basin. These are some studies that we've worked on over the years, thinking about if you look at sub-watersheds within an urban area, this Dugway on the left of the screen, just the idea that within every, watershed and sub-watershed within a city, the land and the underlying hydrology are telling you something about where you should build and, more importantly, where you should not build. And now that we have, such a large inventory of vacant lots, these are properties that are held, in the land bank, half of them or so. So we can make decisions about where to build and where not to build, so that if we are experiencing in-migration, it's happening in a way that's not causing, long-term damage to the Great Lakes. It's just a diagram. I show it to anybody who will listen to me that, particularly in the parts of Cleveland where we have buried waterways, culverted streams, water running underground in pipes. We shouldn't build on top of those areas, and especially now that we have so much vacant land to work with, can we designate, kind of parcels that are in the land bank that align with these kind of hidden hydrologies, so that they become no-build zones and eventually, kind of become the green infrastructure that can support regrowth and redevelopment, but again, along a more sustainable and equitable pattern. So who are we even talking about when we talk about climate-related refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants? It's important to note that even though a lot of people in depopulating cities think about in-migration as a potential, kind of revitalization strategy, having a lot of migrants arrive at once can be extraordinarily challenging, as we've been seeing in recent years. The image on the left is New York City last summer. New York City actually received a total of about 95,000 migrants last year. At any given time, there are about 60,000 migrants and refugees in New York City that are in need of assistance. And even though New York is a really big city, a city of 8.5 million people with a lot of resources, kind of the 95,000 migrants that they received last year really put a strain on their system, as you can see in this photo, and lots of others that were, kind of throughout the media, kind of over the last several months. People sleeping, kind of in the street because the capacity of local agencies to absorb in-migration at that level, it just couldn't handle it. The image on the right is of Denver. The city of Denver is a self-declared sanctuary city, a really generous, progressive place, but they also received the highest per capita, kind of rate of in-migration of anywhere in the country. So Denver's a smaller city, of course, 750,000 people live in Denver. They had 40,000 migrants last year, and it's been hard, because there are a lot of needs from existing residents, and so diverting resources to support the needs of newcomers is, kind of potentially really challenging. I looked it up this morning. The city of Denver spends about $3.5 million per week, supporting the needs of migrants and refugees, which is something that's pretty difficult to sustain, especially for a city of just 750,000 people. They're getting some support from the federal government, but nowhere near what they need to actually be able to help tend to the needs of this influx of new residents. So you might say, well, maybe in-migration to the Great Lakes won't be necessarily, kind of people coming in desperate circumstances. Maybe in-migration will be people who, kind of just, kind of choose to come to the Great Lakes because of the stability and the, kind of more temperate climate. I'm going to suggest, though, that may also pose some challenges. Climate gentrification is something that, kind of is potentially on the horizon, where people arriving with money and resources might actually displace existing residents, particularly some of our more vulnerable and underserved residents will find themselves kind of priced out of their neighborhoods and forced into situations where they are put more at risk. The photo on the right is people protesting in Miami because, Miami is dealing with sea level rise in real time, and it's putting a lot of financial pressure on the Little Haiti neighborhood, a historic, important ethnic enclave where residents are seeing property values skyrocket as people with resources who still want to be in Florida and want to be in Miami are moving further inland and putting pressure on, kind of these longstanding communities. Right. So a lot of the questions that we ask when we think about climate migration, kind of, is the population really going to grow due to an influx of in-migration, or will we see, kind of cities and regions in the Great Lakes, the older industrial cities, continue to decline in some way? Will new arrivals come gradually, or will there be, kind of a sudden influx after, kind of something climate emergency happens elsewhere in the country? Will new arrivals be coming with lower incomes and needs, or will they be coming with higher incomes and demands? Are we looking at an influx of young families who might need different sorts of things than if, kind of the populations of our region, kind of continue, kind of aging? Will in migration result in more diverse communities or less diverse communities? Will we see, kind of more languages, more culture, more, kind of variability and change, and all the, kinds of social and economic questions that that involves? So the answer, there's no answer to these kinds of questions. It's all sort of to be determined. And so bringing us to the end here is like, what can potential receiving communities do to prepare when there's so much uncertainty about whether in-migration will happen or not, kind of whether it will be fast or slow, who's coming, who's not, what can we do to prepare? One thing I would suggest is that, kind of as a first step, really, is to kind of look at Indigenous land and water rights. I go to meetings all the time. We talk about, kind of these land statements and acknowledgements of the ancestral homelands of the peoples who lived in the Great Lakes region. But now is the time, before we start, kind of promoting the Great Lakes region as, kind of, y'all come, this is a climate haven, to really kind of come to terms with the fact that, a lot of the land and the water that we're talking about isn't really ours to give in the first place. And so getting serious about, kind of understanding the rights and claims that Indigenous people have on the Great Lakes Basin, I think is a critical first step. And then after that, if you're looking for, kind of some exciting silver bullet answer, I'm sorry to say I don't have that. What I'll suggest instead is that the things we should be doing to prepare are the things that we should be doing anyway. Climate action plans, climate equity policies, weatherizing housing, kind of developing microgrids, investing in green infrastructure, renewable energy, public transit, really all of the things, kind of that communities can do to prepare for climate change are really the things we should be doing to prepare for climate migration. Our little research team refers to this as getting your house in order, right? If you are planning a big party and you're not sure how many people are coming, what do? You get your house ready. You do all of the things to prepare. And if, kind of a lot of people come, great, you're all set. If they don't come, well, worst case scenario, at least your house is clean and it, kind of functions well for the people who already live there. So these kind of getting your house in order strategies, these no regret strategies, because there's really no downside to doing the things we need to be doing anyway. If you are in your communities already doing these things, that's fantastic. But I'm going to just suggest here that we should be doing them faster and with a greater sense of urgency. Because what I see sometimes, especially when we have really, kind of pleasant weather like we have today in Cleveland, or last summer was beautiful, kind of in Northeast Ohio, it becomes kind of, it becomes a little bit easy to feel complacent. And I think that, kind of the risks are on the horizon. We just don't know exactly what they are yet. So doing all the things we should be doing, but maybe picking up the pace a little bit. Lastly, I'll just say that, kind of on this kind of question of, kind of what the future may hold for Great Lakes cities, we are currently working on a publication, Urban Infill number 9. It's our journal that comes out occasionally. The upcoming issue is focused on climate migration. If you or anybody are working on these kinds of issues, I would, kind of encourage and welcome you to submit your work for Urban Infill. We're particularly interested in questions of equity, of design and creative visualization of what the cities, kind of the Great Lakes may look like and evolve into in light of climate migration. And then the last section of the journal will focus on, kind of strategies and indicators so that we can begin to understand what to look for. What are the sort of tipping points where we'll know which direction things are heading toward. So we welcome all kinds of content. You can see the full call for submissions at our website. website. And I'll also just mention that if you go to our website, all of the previous issues of urban infill, all 8 of them are out there. If you sign up for our newsletter, you will get notified when the new issue is out. But also when you subscribe, you can also choose a past issue that we'll send you for free if you're interested in any of the topics we've looked at before. So with that, I'm going to stop and see if anyone has questions, comments, or things that you want to talk about.
Thank you for that presentation, Terry. Wow, yeah, a lot to plan for. And I really did appreciate your emphasis on the directional change taking place and what we expect to take place over the next couple of decades, and how we need to plan for the unexpected.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, as our attendees are drafting some questions for us, I was wondering. I know like people in this sort of setting don't like to guess which way we're headed, but in terms of development scenarios with that exploratory scenario planning, which one do you think might be the most likely over the next like 2, 3, 4 decades here?
Well, I mean, the cynical side of me, just based on what I know of human nature, is that, kind of the path of least resistance would be that if we start to see, kind of the population stabilize and begin to regrow in cities like Cleveland and Youngstown and Akron, that the development might just do what development does, which is, kind of moving out, kind of to the periphery. And it wouldn't even necessarily be, kind of net zero development. I mean, if in-migration is happening, kind of at a steady but not overwhelming pace, you could see ongoing suburbanization and claiming of sort of lands in the, kind of townships and the exurban areas of the region. It could easily happen that way, unless there is local, state, and federal policies that would encourage more compact and energy efficient development. So the bottom line is I don't know, but just kind of watching what's happened in the region for the last several decades, you could easily sort of imagine sort of continuing along the path that we always have, because that's sort of how the world works sometimes. Chris, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I can't hear you. Somehow I lost you again.
Sorry, fellas, a little bit of technical difficulties now. You can hear me now?
I can hear you now.
Okay, all right. I took out my headphones. I guess my office will be hearing the rest of this podcast today or webinar. But yeah, okay. What I was saying, anyways, is that like I've seen future projections for like emission scenarios, like the different projections on like whether we have like business as usual or a lot of mitigation. Anyways, what I'm saying is that like I feel like that's the same way with development without like without actual government oversight and which way the development is going, it's probably just going to continue doing the same thing. Like you spend a lot of time talking about inertia, like economic inertia and stuff. So yeah. Anyways, though, someone did have a question. Hold up. Okay. Have there been efforts in state or federal legislators to define the Great Lakes as an entity with legal rights?
Not that I'm aware of. There's an exhibition actually underway right now at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Cleveland, that focuses on exactly this issue. So it's both an art installation and also an advocacy piece to create, kind of legal standing for the Great Lakes. I'm sort of remembering that one community, maybe it was Toledo, began
Yeah.
the effort to, kind of give Lake Erie its own voice and its own rights, particularly in light of the water crisis that happened in Toledo several years ago. But I don't know of any others, and I don't know whether, kind of there's plans, to kind of grant that sort of status to the Great Lakes Basin.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I remember when the city of Toledo did that. I think it was in like 2014. I remember that made like national headlines. Yeah. Yeah, that was pretty cool. But yeah, moving on to the next question though. Someone has asks, do you know if the 15-minute walkable city plan for Cleveland is factoring into planning for migration?
It's a good question. We did a workshop April of last year that had people from Cleveland and Cuyahoga County just
Mhm.
beginning to sketch some climate migration scenarios. I
Mhm.
think in some ways the 15-minute city model, kind of aligns well with the idea, kind of more sustainable neighborhoods. But I don't know that they're directly, kind of planning for in migration. I think regardless of whether the city grows, stabilizes, or declines in population, the City Planning Commission is looking to kind of create these walkable, vibrant nodes throughout the city.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I myself have seen like recent developments around like Cleveland proper that seem to be a lot more dense than what you would find in like the periphery of like the urban like the urban center around Cleveland. Um, yeah, that would be that'd be great to see if like municipalities were to promote that sort of development more. Somebody asks, sorry, hang on a second. Do you have any ideas on how to make commercial? Like I was really intrigued by how you were talking about how Cleveland might attract water intensive businesses, like the Great Lakes region, but in of itself might attract that sort of thing. You mentioned semiconductors. Is that like a water intensive business? I didn't know that. That's
Yeah,
cool.
it takes a lot
Is
of
it?
water for sure.
Yeah, isn't like Intel, I heard that Intel was developing some sort of like chip plant in Columbus or something, but they're not in the Great Lakes region, aren't they?
I mean, we're a Great Lakes state, right? And I think that the Intel development, the Intel investment is so huge that it's going to
Yeah,
ripple, kind of throughout the state. So potentially, yeah.
yeah, I see. That's cool. Yeah, so I actually haven't like I'm not aware of any First Nations still like living in the state of Ohio. Like I don't think there are any federally recognized tribes in Ohio. At least like there are no reservations. And like when you brought up like, well, what do indigenous peoples think about this next coming influx of migration? Um, and like how can we incorporate their voices into planning for new waves of people to come here? I was wondering, like in your research, did you have you at all like discussed this possible migration with First Nation communities?
Yeah, we're experiencing the same challenge in the sense that we have begun having the conversation. Our partner on the work is at the University at Buffalo. And in the Niagara region, I mean, there are, kind of reservations and registered tribes who, ironically and horribly, have, kind of limited to no access to fresh water. There's some areas where indigenous people rely on bottled water because even in a water-rich region like Niagara, they don't have access to it.
Mm,
Um, Ohio's, Ohio's sort of second Trail of Tears was so complete and aggressive and horrifying that you're right. I mean, there's not a, kind of presence, but the tribe members who, kind of for whom the Lake Erie is their ancestral lands, they still exist. There's a land rights and a land return movement. So we have not at this point in this work really had that conversation. We don't have the standing to really even begin it. It really has to happen at the level of, kind of state and local governments, to take this seriously. And I've noticed when we do like land acknowledgements at the beginnings of workshops around climate migration, people acknowledge it, and then there's silence, because I think that people sort of struggle to find a path, to kind of do the equitable and ethical thing here. So I think it's an area, of huge need, for additional research and conversations.
Honestly, I agree with you in that. I mean, like trying to think about my own exposure to indigenous communities around here, I barely think of anything. The only thing that that comes to mind is those infamous like like annual indigenous protests outside of the first Indians game each year. I don't know what tribes they were a part of, whether they were even from here to begin with. I mean, the whole Trail of Tears era with like indigenous displacement, they were pretty much, I mean, yeah, I hate to generalize, but like there was like just so much movement. And I know that just like tribes over tribes were like put together in areas where like they have no familiarity with, such as like the migration out to Oklahoma. Yeah, so like the people who originally lived on this land, their descendants, I've got no idea where they are now. I really don't.
I mean, there are organizations, they're small, but kind of are organizations who've organized the protests. There are sometimes events out at,
Mhm.
kind of in the metro parks in the summer. I think that it's finding ways to amplify those voices and dig a little deeper into understanding, kind of the history that made Ohio the way that it is. I was just reading last summer, not in Cleveland, but south of here, where the mound builders have these, kind of World Heritage sites, one of which is a golf course. Then there's people are
Where?
helping on, kind of, on a burial mound. So I think that there's a lot of education, a lot of
Mhm.
conversations that need to happen, and that really
Yeah.
does need to be part of whatever happens in terms of planning for population dynamics, is to really understand kind of where we sit in that like continuum.
Yeah. Honestly, I totally agree with like everything you said about like trying to include them more into the conversation about like just where things are headed here, and just acknowledge the injustice of displacing them when our ancestors, or well, the first European arrivals, like what they did to what they did to them. I think like it's just good to hear there's like an upward trend in like discussions about those things.
And the
Yeah.
displacement question ripples on through, right? I mean, as I was talking about,
Yeah.
is that, kind of, if we think about, kind of throwing the doors open to new investment and new residents, to really understand the people who were here and also the people who are
Mhm.
here,
Mhm.
because there are a lot of communities that are extremely under-resourced, and so devoting public dollars toward, kind of repopulating a city where there are already people here who are in, serious need. All of that needs to be part of the conversation, in addition to sort of the physical, the design, the ecological, and infrastructural kinds of
Yeah.
questions. These social underpinnings are critical.
Yeah, no, yeah, I mean, like for sure, let's definitely take care of the people who are here to begin with. And I actually think that one of those scenarios that the exploratory planning you laid out in your presentations, I think one was actually dedicated to population decline here, like a continued population decline. Um, like I understand that it seems that we eventually will have an influx of people, but I suppose there still is a scenario where that really doesn't happen, and the distribution of the population here will just will either continue to change or stay the same. Um, Either way, though, like it's still good we're having these conversations on like how to plan for like how to design our cities and lay things out.
Yeah, I mean, the unpredictability can't be underestimated. You
Yeah.
know, I've been working in this region for a really long time, and if you look at the
Mhm.
plans that were developed in the 60s and 70s for cities like Cleveland and Youngstown, they were all kind of predetermined, this idea that, kind of the cities were going to continue to grow. And everyone was kind of caught flat-footed when the world began to turn in a different direction. So when we look at scenarios, we look at, kind of, will climate impacts be extreme or will they be moderate? Will population grow or will it, kind of stabilize or decline? I think kind of exploring all of those alternatives and really digging deep into what that might mean, what might cause that, because
Mhm.
you could sort of imagine a situation where, kind of the political power of other regions of the country are diverting federal resources to addressing climate change in those areas that we always think of as climate impacted. In the meantime, kind of circumstances here become more and more and more difficult. So people might continue to still move into coastal and Sunbelt areas if they feel
Yeah.
like the resources in the Midwest and in the Great Lakes just aren't there to deal with the stuff we're dealing with.
Yeah. Personally, like big picture wise, I think that people like still moving there. It's like, I mean, it just seems incredibly short-sighted as as a directional policy change. Even though like there are many things that go into deciding, there are many things that a person considers when deciding where to move and if they should move at all. So like I don't want to simplify it either, but the fact remains there, like the trend in this country is that people are moving to places with much higher climate risk than say here, for instance, with much greater risk for stranded assets and um, like future climate disasters. So like when considering like where federal dollars should go in preparing um, like for the future, like I guess like it's kind of hard to really prioritize helping people on the front lines of these sort of things while at the same time getting places that are going to be future destinations ready for that change. Like, I mean, it's hard to say who doesn't deserve funding, but like at the same time, everybody everywhere is saying, "Hey, can I have more funding?" So I don't know how like the government would go about trying to prioritize that sort of thing.
I mean, I think the way that it has been happening is that when, kind of crises happen, that federal funds are allocated to address those crises, and you can't argue with that. You want to help people who are, kind of dealing with a horrific wildfire or a, kind of life-threatening hurricane. I mean, there's no real choice there to say, well, you guys moved there, but it's critical, right? That, kind of the resources go where there's emergencies and needs. That's why,
Mhm.
though sometimes the dollars for preparation to avoid those kind of crises, it, it's just sort of human nature, right? I mean,
Yeah.
when something's on fire, you race to put out the fire rather
Yeah.
than, necessarily fireproofing before the fire starts,
Mhm.
So, I mean, I think that that's kind of, I haven't really looked at the ways that the federal government, the way that FEMA has been, kind of allocating funding. I know the numbers are huge. I also know that FEMA policies really help people relocate after a disaster, normally within 15 or 20 minutes of where they lived. So getting people a little bit out of harm's way, but not to a
Mhm.
completely different region. And I'm,
Yeah.
in fairness, it's not a bad strategy if somebody is living in a low-lying area and you can move them 20 minutes so that they're on a higher elevation. It makes a lot more sense in terms of resettlement than picking them up and moving them to Detroit. I mean, it's just
Mhm. Yeah.
more expedient and more cost effective, and that's kind of what's been happening. You're not seeing, I mean, people
Sure.
do move across the country, but in the aftermath of a disaster, people tend to move fairly nearby until they see what's going to
Mhm.
happen, if rebuilding is going to happen, and whether they can go back home. Because
Mhm.
people, people are tied to the places where they are. Some people move, but a lot of people want to stay put to the extent that they can.
Yeah, sure. And Yeah, I think your map showing like where people moved after Hurricane Katrina, how did they label it? The Katrina diaspora.
Mhm.
I remember noting that like the biggest arrows were just to surrounding states, which like I think totally makes sense, especially based off of what you just mentioned of why people move and where they move. But yeah, all right, Terry. I think we've pretty much gone through all the questions that have been asked. So if you're ready to wrap up, I'm ready too.
For sure. Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
This is fun. Do reach out if you're doing work related to this. We love to hear what people have going on because it's an evolving field. These kinds of questions are something they're going to be with us for a while, so it would be great to keep the conversation going.
Yeah, no, totally agree as well, Terry. I thought it was an incredibly fascinating presentation, and I really do think that you guys at Kent State are on the cutting edge of this sort of thing, especially in this part of the Great Lakes in the world. So thank you again for giving the presentation, and hope we talk soon.
Yeah, thanks a bunch. Bye.
Thank you. And to our attendees, thank you for coming, and hope to see you at the next webinar. All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice day.
Bye.